I would say first and foremost, an idea of the horoscope as a portal into the personal fairy tale of the individual, right? And within that world, we have the more than human, and we also have the ancestors. The Venus in the ninth house configuration almost always comes with some sort of inherited or pre-birth ordained sort of familiar or spirit consort. It's just a thing I've noticed.
Hello and welcome to the Spirit Box podcast, where we explore folklore, magic and the world of the spirits and everything in between. For episode number 84, it is my great pleasure to welcome the fascinating and erudite Sasha Ravitch. Now, Sasha is an astrologer, a practitioner of folkloric witchcraft and a psycho-spiritual counsellor. In the show, we get into the intersection of both the astrology and aforementioned folkloric witchcraft, and how Sasha has noticed the prevalence of repeating astrological patterns in relation to spirit and non-human issues and relationships that her clients may have. It's really quite remarkable, and I think for a lot of you who listen to this show because you have these kind of interactions going on in your life, this is going to be something I think quite revelatory for you. We get into the frequently multi-generational origin of these issues, and Sasha gives us some tremendous insight into the types of issues that occur, including magical pacts by ancestors that might be unfulfilled, spirit marriages, and indeed old curses that follow us down through our family lines. Sasha also describes the significant impact of having a mentor to guide her through her spiritual experiences as a young witch, and really helps highlight the importance of having a community initiatory practice and practitioners to help those in spiritual crises, something that we broadly lost in the West, but we still see very prevalent in other areas of the world, and it's something that we need to learn and we need to really foster here in the Western countries where this show is recorded. We posed the question in the show: was the shared trauma of COVID a significant factor in the upsurge in interest and the practice of all things occult? And the reason for that is we tracked it back to, say, the Scottish witch trials, and looking at the confessions, the extracted confessions of the women who endured those trials, always pointed to a point of trauma when spirits first made contact, that a contact that would develop into the relationship and ultimately the individual becoming a practicing witch or cunning woman. In the Plus show, we discuss Sasha's pain wife lineage, a specific form of witchcraft related to fertility problems that originated in Romania and the Balkans. We also get into her Shamenka heritage, or that of a fairy seer. You may remember last year we had Dr. Maria Voivod on the show discussing this particular type of spirit practice in some detail. I'll leave the link to that in the show notes for those of you who might have missed it. And then we discussed the fairy swan maiden and the lore of the Cygnus constellation. The Plus show for this episode is superb, so lols at you if you're not a patron. To that end, if you'd like to support the show and become one of the shining ones, then come and join the Patreon. If Patreon isn't your thing, check out my link tree for other ways to support. You can always buy me a book if you want to hear me waffle about a particular subject you like. That's how you do it. Now that my e-begging is out of the way, let's get into the show and hear from Sasha. Sasha Ravitch, you're very welcome to the Spirit Box. Lovely to have you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, what the listeners won't know, but I'm going to confess it now, is I've already murdered the pronunciation of your name, which is a great start. The great start to the show. But you know, you're the latest in a long line of people's names that I've murdered on the show. So welcome to Spirit Box. It's lovely to have you.
It's probably like apotropaic to mispronounce my name, because you can maybe only say it 2 times. If you say it a 3rd time, who knows what's going to happen? I might appear in your house. God forbid.
Well, I mean, you can't make anything worse than it. Well, you obviously could, but obviously
Don't give me a challenge.
Yeah. No, I'll see about that. Given
you give me permission, you invite me in, it's all over, right?
It is lovely to have you on the show. I know we've been chatting back and forth for some time now, and you're really welcome to the show. And to get things started and to kind of introduce yourself to the audience, could you tell them a little bit about yourself, your work? I find your background and how you present astrology really, really intriguing and so interesting. So if you could tell the listeners a little bit about that.
This is always the hardest part for me because I really struggle with talking about myself. My ideas, not a problem. I guess I would describe myself first and foremost as a spirit worker, as a folkloric witch, and that inspires and informs everything I do from there. And after that, I would describe myself as a writer. And I think that is perhaps part of what has ended up differentiating my approach to astrology, though I became interested in witchcraft and astrology sort of simultaneously. It was around, really started maybe reading in earnest around 13, but around 10, this was like the cool point, right? This was the generation of Harry Potter. The world was opened up, and, I come from a lineage of La Roma people, and my mother was really open and started buying me books on different types of fortune telling from a really early age. So for me, living in the world already is a very imaginal place, and as a only child who spent perhaps a little too much time trying to seek companionship in the other world, and having that inform my desire for right relationship with the ecologies around me. This is where my astrological practice comes from as well, which is, I would say, first and foremost, an idea of the horoscope as a portal into the personal fairy tale of the individual, right? And within that world, we have the more than human, and we also have the ancestors. And these bring to life and make phonic, make terrestrial, and in many ways make material things that we are used to reading about astrologically as concepts or hypotheticals or allegorical or metaphorical. And I think there's a real distinction between a folk tale, allegory, or parable, where there's tangible and visceral consequence, and the way a lot of the Western, in particular Western astrological canon is perceived, where we're looking at technique and not necessarily connection and relationship, even within the astrological magic community, where the idea of perhaps engaging with stellar spirits from a place of chthonic rite is very counterintuitive to what is now populated common conception and preconception via like lodge magicians and the appropriate way to invoke a celestial spirit, right? So I think that probably creates the alembic through a lot of what my personal approach is and why it is perceived as different, though I have many incredible peers that are also really deeply exploring the magical and witchcraft formularies within the nativity now. I'm really excited to be a part of what I feel like is its own Geist, and it's becoming more imminent and challenging and pushing back against some of the more strident traditional things have to be this particular way, and we must remove the head from the body in order to think clearly. So that's what I would try. It was supposed to be a clear and concise summary, and I ended up rhapsodic. Big surprise.
One of the things I find really interesting about your work and how you've described it there is that there's you're not siloing your speciality. You're looking to break out of kind of some of the confines of a traditional approach to astrology. And I love how you bring in the idea of, well, what's within the line, what's within the ancestry, and it's something that is starting to really become more and more apparent, kind of in my own personal life, and certainly when we talk about the other and relationships with the other, like, again, it just keeps coming up again and again that there are like quite long-lasting, multi-generational relationships with spirits, with particular entities, with clans, whatever way you want to describe, collections of beings that comes up again and again, and I feel that kind of what you're doing, your process, what you're surfacing, is like another. It's like another tool set to help unpack
absolutely
some of those challenges. Really, really remarkable stuff.
Yeah, I thank you for saying that. And it was actually a very frightening journey for me to pursue these particular areas of astrology. And, the more research I do, the more I came to realize that there was nothing new about what I was doing, right? It all gets filed under folk astronomy for the most part, right? This is sort of colloquialism to anthropologically diminish any legitimacy to it. And so because it gets compartmentalized over there, we don't see the witchcraft lineage association with it. And we also don't see the astrological magic association with it, or the mythological stuff, right? And so I think a lot of astrologers that I am friends with are starting to try and incorporate more of that from a lens of cultural competency and wanting a more emic experience. But it was scary because I was trained in much more of the traditional astrological magic lineage and traditions. And, I would swear by I had to do the appropriate timings a la Picatrix or Higamenantea or the Heptameron, all of these grimoires, which I really cherished and informed. Like, I'm not going to pretend they didn't inform so much of my foundational praxis. But I felt so frozen in these processes. And it was so hard for me to experience the natal chart as an unalive thing, which is what I feel happens a lot in the traditional forms of astrology that are more perhaps accepted and validated, right? Is that it's like looking at a frozen moment of time. And that was not the way I was able to engage with the nativity, which I have at this point I refer to as scrying, the black mirror of the natal chart, right? Because there's a busyness and a population, and there's an aliveness, and there's a whole world, and each house of the nativity is its own part of this enchanted forest that you have to find your way through. And each of these houses is populated with a particular spirit that is going to be a guide, or a particular spirit that might be an obstacle. And there's different ancestors along the way. And this was, I couldn't not see this. And I started to take a little bit of a risk, a chance, right? By espousing or sharing some of what I was seeing with clients. When I was doing everything, in my opinion, very traditionally by the book, to be a good little professional astrologer who didn't try and break any rules or incorporate her own personal gnosis, right, into stuff, because that's a huge taboo if you wanted to be taken seriously and present at conferences or publish books. But the more I allowed myself to take some of these risks, incorporating a pretty rapid initiatory nature to spirit sight over the past year and a half in particular, the more positive feedback I got, the more really, really intense validation for what I was seeing, and gratitude for a point of direction and a navigation of this otherworldly but very endemic to the native cartography. And then it got to a point where I really couldn't go back, right? I'd wandered a little too far. I had passed through the hedge, and I wasn't going to be allowed back into a more standard or a more perhaps consensual astrological tradition. I was too far into the forest. I had eaten the food. I had, I drank of the cream. And this is now, I feel, in many ways, mostly all that I can do. And the only thing I really truly enjoy doing, and I've been very grateful to have a lot of success and a lot of validation for a thing that I thought would surely get me like hashtag canceled from a culture at large.
Sure. Well, I know many people will be very grateful that you decided to plow on into the woods, and keep going with it. It's interesting that you use that phrase, kind of folk, as a wraparound term for how kind of some aspects of academic culture look down on traditions seen as kind of less educated. Because I was just thinking while you were talking about kind of like some of the actual just conventional language that people use in a very kind of disposable way, people being kind of born under a wandering star, that kind of stuff. And it's just made me kind of think, is that those folk expressions actually have a basis for some of that language, where people are actually determining that from going to people like yourself with heritage like yours, and trying to unpack the nuances of their child or their child's future.
Well, it was interesting because I anticipated much more pushback, and albeit this is what I know of into my face, right? Mm-hmm. But I was, and throughout my life, I've been perhaps overly focused on how others would perceive me. And that's, I think, something that's really kind of exacerbated by being a public figure or being known, right? It's an incredible risk to do something that feels genuine for you, but you don't know how it will be received when you are a person who cares a lot about how you are perceived and have chronic, perhaps people-pleasing streak. And I was anticipating a lot more rejection, humiliation, or any myriad of things that I would have considered, career-ending fears or stigmas, and was instead met by quite the opposite, which for me, was a great reality test over how many times we prevent ourselves from pursuing what is authentic or true, or the dreams or will that is integral to us unnecessarily, under the premise that other people are not going to understand it. But it also showed me that there's a real hunger and a real need for folks right now to acquiesce in some way to re-enchantment, to the imaginal, to the the magical, the mysterious, to their own personal mythologies, through the sense of being connected to something greater and more than, to recognizing that they come from somewhere ancient, and that there is a whole collective, a whole community that holds them. And I think in many ways, the pandemic exacerbated that, because people were met with an unprecedented awareness of feeling isolated or alone. And when you recognize it, even when you feel utterly alone, you have a whole community, a whole collection, a whole court of spirits, of more than human and ancestral spirits around you. There's this incredible moment where you become Arachne spinning the web, and every little gesture, every little movement ricochets and connects to you as your body is a tuning fork for this sense of interconnectivity with more than. And that's a huge balm. And that's something that many cultures had as a precept for their beliefs, right? This is an animist precept, right? That we're all connected, that we're not alone. And I think that a positive thing that came out of a very tragic thing like this pandemic is that people are considering other ways of being connected at this point. And I think that's part of the reason why my work has also been received, because that's ultimately what I'm seeking to help people with.
That makes an awful lot of sense. And I think you've really hit on something there, and certainly kind of in the precursor to you discussing the kind of the lockdown and the effects of lockdown, the pandemic, about people looking for meaning, and looking for, or not necessarily looking for enchantment, but trying to interpret it and trying to understand what's happening to them in either kind of very dramatic ways or very small ways. But I think there is there was a real trigger point in a shift in mindset around the initial lockdowns and pandemics, where it's not only just that kind of being cut off from other people. It's like, well, actually the machine that we're all part of shut down.
Absolutely.
So you don't have the headspace for being kind of like, well, I got to get this work done. I got to do X, Y, and Z. Yeah. All that kind of stuff just paused. And all of a sudden, let's park the likes of kind of being connected to the internet for a bit, but you were in your own space by yourself. Mm-hmm. Everything was on pause. And then you had this kind of like massive spike in interest in areas that we explore,
absolutely
huge.
And so many of my peers and I were surprised by all of a sudden how many people were registering for our classes, or what an influx of consultations were being booked. I think a combination of people finally, I want to bring it back to the fact that you mentioned meaning, because I think this is one of a nexus point for the majority of my work, and why I do is a person who's kind of existentially bothered at any given point and need to be able to create a constellation of meaning around them. And I think that this was such, again, a place of existential crisis for the world, that alternative ways, or perhaps ways that weren't formally entertained, of making meaning were suddenly considered as viable resources. The dream people had that there could be an avenue of power or control, right? And that's what it comes down to. And this is a big thing for me with witchcraft, which I think has been sanitized in popular culture to a profane degree, right? Where there's a monstrous desire for power. This is you are anti-human and anti-nature. You are changing the will and the trajectory of the world to make it more comfortable, to fit your needs, right? And in moments of absolute helplessness or powerlessness, these moments of crisis, this is where we begin to reach for the things that people tell us even exist or aren't real. That there's a level of desperation there, right? When you look at a lot of folk tales and fairy tales, there's a crisis moment often to the evil character that we learn, right? To the bad guy, to the villain, to the witch, to whatever, where some traumatic event or some rendering of powerlessness led them to a need to become monstrous and inhuman and have more power and siphon the life force of others, etc. And I think that on a weirdly collective level, that's what the world experienced. And subsequently, there was a little bit of a subsidized income for a very short period of time, and not nearly enough. But suddenly people did not have to work, and they still had a little bit, for a lot of people, actually more money than they were making before come in, and they could engage in expenses that felt nourishing as opposed to essential, right? Or as a form of escapism. And I think that combination of powerlessness and suddenly, subsequently, a power allowed for a culture where most of my peers and friends are infinitely further along than we thought we would be for the beginning of this pandemic, and what we thought it would mean for our profession, for our vocation, for our communities.
That's really interesting, and to build on your point on, what those triggers of desperation, what they make people do in terms of reaching out, and those points of pressure, stress, and what have you. It's interesting that they're also the moments when spirits tend to reach out to people. At those points of crisis, and we see all that in the records of the Scottish witch trials. Where these familiars turned up, and they turned up generally in these points of desperation. I'd be
famine and pestilence, and I mean, we rarely in society, right? We're rarely in a vacuum, whether it's through social media, whether it's through walking down the street, etc. And I think many of us can remember that if you were in a place where there was a lockdown, chill of like having to drive through your town, usually populated, and I live in New Orleans, so there's always people outside, right? And driving, for instance, through the French Quarter and seeing it completely abandoned was our own little apocalyptic moment. And I do think that it isn't that the spirits are not always trying to communicate with us. I think they are always there, but we are so desensitized a lot of times, or we're not listening, or we're distracted, right? There was less to have to compete with. And that I think that availed itself to people in a way where, and also there was a sense of initiation on a collective scale. We were looking at a tragic amount of unnecessary death. And that activates the spiritual landscape, the dead that have died before, right? And a risk to the descendants is going to activate the antecedents. So there was, I think, a frenzy in the more than human, the ancestral, and the ensouled human mortal world, all happening simultaneously on all these different levels, which allowed perhaps, through unfortunate circumstances, this opportunity into greater introspection and awareness where the worlds collided. There was more friction.
I think an interesting take. I mean, I think it is that kind of, they said out of every crisis is an opportunity, and we went through a passage of time where there was two enormous factors with it, is that we had a collective experience on a scale that none of our generations had experienced, right? The most generations who have gone through that kind of collective trauma, I mean, have gone through the horrors of global conflict and what have you. And I don't want to kind of in any way measure what kind of we went through sitting at home versus kind of the traumas of war. But it's what I'm trying to tease out badly is there's that collective trauma that we haven't experienced generationally, and that collects in some way a critical mass that may have kind of allowed this this interest to spike in the way it has. I mean, it's been remarkable. I mean, like things like myself and a friend of mine, we built a thing called the Sigil Engine, really as kind of just a little art experiment, little digital tool to design sigils. It's made over 1 million, and it's coming up to 1.5 million sigils. It's ridiculous, so there's a huge interest in people using these things. So yeah, it's remarkable, really.
When you think about how many forms of spirituality are contingent upon a consistent meditation on death and mortality, it makes sense that when an entire planet is confronted by a shared awareness of imminent, and that's not to say that there aren't people that are aware of that every day, but I would say, especially for many Americans, that isn't a preoccupation, right?
Sure.
And when you think about whether it's sabbatic witchcraft, whether it's Buddhism, whether all we're working with a need to sit and confront our own mortality, to recognize, be close to, accept our death, to meditate, in fact, on the ways in which we will imminently die, what that would look like, how that would feel. All these things are being projected into us through the media, through social media, right? Through text message alerts about, death rates spiking due to all of these things are forcing somewhat non-consensual trajectory for the mind frame to be focused on death in ways that I think a lot of people aren't used to. And that also is going to, across the board, make one think about what else is out there, what is next, whether it's by fear and necessity or a genuine longing or desire.
Exhaustion.
There's so much there, right?
Yeah, no, yeah, absolutely. It's a really salient point there, and I'm thinking back really, even though the precursor to COVID, there was just like so much division in society, and it
Yeah.
becomes so polarized. So you end up in this place where there's actually kind of been, it's not just the COVID years, it's the precursor to it. This is kind of been bubbling up, and then kind of culminates in this endless pressure from, as the components you've already mentioned. It's no wonder that people are going to go, well, there has to be something more than this. More give this meaning. Anyway, change tack a little bit.
Yeah.
I wanted to kind of to ask you about some of the cases that you've worked on, or clients rather, some of the readings. For those ones that you are comfortable to talk about, I understand that you may kind of that not be an area you might not want to explore, but where you were able to pick up some of that stuff around lineage and where there were spirit beings or planetary energies influencing kind of multiple generations. I'd love to hear about.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it happened in somewhat of an organic way, sense that when you're seeing 20 to 40 to 60 people a month, right, for years and years, you're seeing so many patterns emerge. And I am really passionate about patterns. I nerd out on them probably more than almost anything else. Being able to seek that consistency, right? It's all in the endeavor of making meaning. If you can find a pattern, you can almost sniff out the potential of meaning somewhere there, and that's really galvanizing for me. But a lot of it started happening through what I would almost say is kind of a post-COVID fugue. So I had noticed trends and patterns, and I tried to keep them much more precise and I would say traditional. And I would look for sources, especially Manilius and Firmicus are two of my favorite that sort of substantiate the kind of work I'm doing. Mm-hmm. But what happened after COVID is and when I say that is by contracting COVID, when I contracted COVID, right, I experienced a brain fugue fog that pretty much debilitated my capacity to articulate or communicate in a salient or eloquent way.
Yeah. I had the same thing. I was messed up for about a week afterwards. I was like thick as pig shit, I believe the expression.
This for me lasted for about 3 months.
Christ.
Where and I'm a person who has spent her whole life very reliant on being able to communicate clearly or quickly or eloquently, right? And writing prolifically throughout my whole life. And it was deeply it seems almost petty or sort of like vain to talk about, but to feel like I didn't have that command over language was really frightening for me. And what I noticed start to happen was that where I couldn't communicate linguistically the way I was used to, as a very cerebral person for most of my life, very cut off from my body, what happened is I was so immersed into and seated within my body that I realized that my spirit sight was activating much more prolifically as someone that didn't have it nearly the way I did until after COVID. And of course, again, as a cerebral person, we go through a lot of pretty distinct self-gaslighting measures around this, like, oh my God, I've got post-COVID psychosis or something, what's going on. But then there was enough kind of rapid fire affirmation and validation by mentors, by teachers, by clients, etc., that I started to recognize that in many ways, losing some of the cerebral, I would say more left brain communication, language, logic-based, astrological delineation means this because according to Vetus Valens, this means that. So this is what I communicate to the client in this way. All that started to get taken away from me. Instead of being like, I see. Okay, I'm not. This is not going to
Sorry,
make sense.
I don't mean to be laughing at you. I just
I'm seeing this thing, and all of a sudden, my ability to fall into the imaginal, right, beyond my lifelong love and passion and utilization of folklore and fairy tale, the necessity of communicating what I was seeing as a thing that was emergent and symbolic and creative, but also very real and communicating with me, I think maybe almost had to come out of me not being able to rely on other faculties. And it's such a westernized academic mind trap to need to qualify, to formulate, to logically substantiate everything. And that's not to say we see a thing in a vision and we take, you do your research, you do your second opinions. All of that's really essential. But our visionary capacities are severely foreshortened by this very phallologocentric need to utilize language and logic to justify experience, right?
I would say at a very fundamental level, there was a lot of argument around the idea of the introduction of writing, the introduction of learning through the written word, and the creation of the written word did a huge change in our ability to understand the imaginal world, to understand and actually integrate and work with the fairy mind or other other type intelligences, because it restructured how we thought.
Well, and I promised several friends that I would not talk about Lacan on this episode. But I mean, this is also what Lacan says, right? The language is a prison that cuts us off from the real, from the imaginal, and it gets to a point where there's no way to not feel like we are losing our mind when we begin to experience the more than, right? What is actually not the real, but a real, right? We're just working with a bunch of different reals. None of these aren't real. No reality isn't real. It's just one of a myriad of reals that we're working amongst. And what I noticed is where I would see patterns before, suddenly upon the pattern, right, I was able to drop into this point. Whether a really good example is that I've brought this up with Gordon White too on Rune Soup, where the Venus in the ninth house configuration almost always comes with some sort of inherited or pre-birth ordained sort of familiar or spirit consort. It's just a thing I've noticed over and over and over again. And if it isn't in the nativity of the individual, it is in the marriage chart of the individual to the spirit, right? And I've been lucky enough to work with quite a few folks at this point who were able to give me the actual event chart for their marriage to their spirit consort. Venus in the ninth house, right? This is and regardless of sign, regardless of stellar phenomena of what, and if it's conjoined or by params in relationship with a certain star, it might tell us more information. And there's modalities and qualities that might give us more information. But I when I know that now, I know to drop in and look there. And it is almost always visibly apparent. It's like there's a need to be seen, because this is a lifetime pact or contract that has been had.
Okay.
Similarly, I had a similar phenomena happen with Saturn in the fourth house, especially if it is ruled by one of the signs that I've come to see as a masculine ruled sign, but even for some of the feminine ruled signs. And I don't mean that in the sense of gender. It's about quality in astrology. And this is where I started to see whole lineages of ancestors pour out and communicate. And all of this, of course, when I first started having these experiences, was really vague, grabbing in the dark. It's really the act of faith and belief, both in ourselves and in the reality of spirit, that allows the form to solidify, right? I think a lot about how a lot of the literature communicates, especially Kirk talks a lot about how fairy or spirit, etc., are perceived as like condensed clouds, right? Or condensed air. And we really see a solidification, a consolidation a materialization, the more we allow ourselves to believe in a thing. And it's not to go into that Peter Pan, clap if you believe, Tinkerbell needs you to clap. But I don't think there's ever been a singular tradition or spirit that hasn't also utilized or relied upon the belief of those they're in relationship with as a way of supporting their ability to materialize, to manifest. And it's not to say that it's requisite, but it's always certainly helped, right? And not getting in your own way also really helps.
Yeah. No, I just a big fat yes to all of that, really. It's when you said that, I was immediately looking at my natal chart till you actually made the shit up. I can't read it. I don't know why I was looking at it.
Just to double check. Yeah.
I was like, okay. But what was I going to say is I find that extraordinary that you can pick it up in the chart as to when kind of that period of the spirit marriage happens or is initiated or agreed as it is in some traditions. But I wonder is the same for visions as well, for kind of profound visions. Is there something in there? I think that would be an interesting thing to explore. When you kind of look at those moments around spirit marriage that you've worked with, have you found those things to be hereditary? And because one of the things that it's kind of bouncing around in my head at the moment is the idea of the outcomes of spirit marriage in terms of like fairy children, children of a result of the relationship between fairies and human beings, as to whether they exist in the in the material or immateria. That there are families in Ireland that claim lineage from fairies. There's a family in Sligo actually that claim lineage from the Selkies, the seal people, which are obviously kind of a type of fairy, as it were. Is that something that's ever come up?
Yes.
Before?
Yes. Yeah. Both in my experience astrologically and through the visionary capacity.
Right.
I believe 100% in this, right? Like that's the foundation. I 100% believe in more and other than human ancestry. None of my work would work, right? If that weren't the case. I also believe it is not as unusual as it is made out to see. I think levels of dilution are really important, right? And we don't want to ever get into fucking blood quantum gross shit. But it wasn't till perhaps, the past several hundred years that the idea of this would even be considered taboo. It was pretty proliferate, right? Yeah, like across pretty much every culture that I've ever found, right? Any folklore I've ever read, this is one of the most foundational, fundamental themes is the human and more than human spirit marriage or love or procreation. I mean, if we're looking at folklore, half of Eastern Europe wouldn't have had countries if there wasn't some more than human ancestry going on, right? Everyone's all the great warriors and knights and kings and queens were all like children of my marriages and everything. So I absolutely believe this. I also believe it isn't, especially, it's not going to be super evident for everyone, and it's not going to matter for everyone, right? But I have found certain consistent delineations, placement, significations, whatever kind of language you want to use, that are often indicative of this particular phenomena. And if you can read my forthcoming book if you want to know what those are.
Exciting.
But yes, I have noticed those, and they tend to actually really interestingly overlap with a lot of folk astronomy, in particular about constellations and stars. And I'll give one freebie in particular. But I mean, everyone already knows the fixed star Alcyone and the Pleiades. If it features heavily within a nativity, there's in my experience, there's often been some substantiated, and I'm not talking about like I look at someone's chart, right? And I'm like, ooh, do you identify with the blah, blah, blah? This is like specific ancestors that I see presented to me, that the person, my client, already has stories from their family about having had those experiences, right? Like there's a level of dual verification that is happening. This is never about like an edification of the ego by making you special. In many ways, the more than human stuff, from my experience, from what I witnessed, it makes life much more difficult.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that. You know, and
you're not special. It's not even good a lot of times. It's not even great.
Yeah, it's genuinely like upsetting.
Yeah.
You know, and like, you know, for people who are close to me that kind of have these kind of experiences, and indeed kind of my own, you know, it's generally not fun. You know,
No.
And at a fundamental level, it's one of those things that I've spoken about this before, is that it severs the anchors to your understanding of the world, and that is a traumatic experience. It'll take a while to digest and understand that, and kind of reform after that kind of happens. But you know, when we kind of look at certain types of vision where people have like, oh, you know, I saw an angel, or what I thought was, it said it was an angel, or, you know, the Archangel Michael is talking to me. You know, one of the first things we do as human beings is go, well, why are you so special that the Archangel Michael is interested in you? You know, Dave. Yeah. You know, like, you know, it's
literally Michael's job to be interested in everyone, right?
Exactly. Exactly. But it's the conceptualizing that it's a solitary individual, that like basically the Archangel Michael has got a certain amount of appointments he works in a day, has to get around the place, you know, rather than kind of
Santa Claus style.
Yeah, exactly. Then he's got a multi-dimensional reality, or it has a multi-dimensional reality. But beyond that, it's the same thing. It's not special. And as an individuals, we're not special experiencing these things. These are innate parts of the human experience.
Yeah.
It's just we've completely erased our understanding of them from the Western mind. The Western mind is where all this stuff is surprising or weird or different. You know, virtually everywhere else in the world has got a far better understanding of how the universe works and what our part is in it, and how we are. It's a participatory experience. You know, we are part of it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. That one really kind of gets me going, you know.
Totally.
Yeah. And it is really, really common. So I've got, in terms of patterns, because this is a really interesting thing. In terms of patterns of what you see, I often notice that you get clusters of friends that start experiencing different parts of the same thing. And it's only when they kind of start working together or discussing it, they start to put the pieces together, and you get those, you know, really kind of crazy synchronicities and stories start to unfold. You know, I guess a kind of an example would be like Hellier is that kind of example of that kind of stuff. But that stuff happens quite a lot to groups of people who are in this kind of area. Now, similarly, I know that you get clusters of birthdays in families. You know, like they'll group around a certain area. Now, I don't have any specific question around that. You know, I don't have Gordon White's mega brain. You know, I'm. You know, what do you notice around those kind of things, like those clusters of birthdays, or like, is there a group aspect to this?
Well, I mean, it's interesting because you brought that up, and my uncle's death day is my birthday, and that's what I've noticed more often than even shared birthday, is a relationship between death day and birthday. Not that there's a direct reincarnation there, but there's some language of signification there. That has not been my primary area of observation. I've been more interested in noticing stellar repetition, certain stars or constellations heavily featuring for ancestral generations or bodies. And I've had the real privilege as an astrologer to work with 4 generations for certain families, right? Like the
Wow.
grandchild, the parent, the grandparent, and the great grandparent. And that, I mean, those sort of experiences, and I've now had quite a few of those, really allowed me to recognize shared or very special synastry, in particular with the planet Saturn.
Right.
Which is part of what led to my whole frenzied obsession and devotion with it, right? It was like, this is the place of anti-meaning, and therefore this is where meaning can actually be cultivated. This is the field that once fallow is turned fertile. As far as this ancestral repetition and pattern, birthdays are not a thing I've been able to notice as much. I think because I have not usually provided a lot of my clients' birthdays. Mm-hmm. But what I will notice is that folks instinctively tend to book on their return of their lunar mansion, whichever decan or lunar mansion they're born with natally. Tends to be ultimately, without them often knowing. Occasionally they'll do it intentionally, but most of the time they're very surprised to hear that they actually booked a session for when the moon was returning to its particular mansion that it was at the time of their birth. Okay. And this for me shows sort of a greater intuitive or instinctive connection to these patterns as well. Or I'll notice, for instance, I had 3 clients last week on the same day that all had the same birthday, but in different years, or were all born in the same city. So I've noticed singularly with me, and I've always wondered, is like this like a common, if there are other astrologers listening to this, please let me know if this is a phenomena you've noticed, or they're all be the same, ascendant sign. There are ways in which I think that I am observing patterns and syncs, but I have no idea what kind of syncs are going on for them more exponentially. I will also say that the synchronicity storms and clusters are very real, and they're also very challenging to navigate, right? And I think on an interpersonal level, I think on a lot of people bound together through trauma or the unknown can be a potentially dangerous and heartbreaking thing. And that there requires perhaps a level of transparency and communication that I don't think a lot of people have, myself included, right? Have a great skill communicating. Is that why? And that's why I think many people, especially what I've noticed, people with more than human or supremely supernatural experiences are deeply emotionally connected and bound together, but ultimately can't sustain the relationship. And that is a thing that I have noticed throughout a lot of my clients as well, stories that they've shared. In particular, when you are yearning for a world, for an experience, you have a blood memory, right? A blood consciousness memory of something that you can't seem to find again in this particular reality.
Right.
Love harder, and then it hurts more. Right. And it's just harder to sustain. And when you look at a lot of the literature of folks that get, snatched and then have to come back, right? There's just never an ability to reconnect or find relationships fulfilling in the same way. That level of pining and yearning just siphons out perhaps part of the live. And my goal with working with clients, especially that have that sort of phenomena in their experience, whether in their direct ancestry or within their lives actively at the moment, is to try and reconnect them to a will or a joy to be present and live, because we don't get to just run away. We can't just do that. Maybe 1 out of a million really actually get to return that way, right? And when you return, it's not the same. You have to find a way to be here. And my goal is to help people find a way to be connected to the enchantment of this experience, but to be here ultimately.
Yeah. I think that's amazing. I really do. I think that there's such value in having people like you in that capacity that people can access. I genuinely think it's so important. I mean, one of the foundational reasons that I created this show was, as I said before, to make sense of my own experiences. But ultimately to add to the bank of knowledge. It's like, well, how can kind of my interest be, useful or of service to others who are kind of,
research.
exactly, and so this is essentially, apart from me getting to talk to really cool, interesting people like yourself, it's the point of it is to share that knowledge, because I even looking at through just looking at things through like even just an Abrahamic prism of like Islam and Christianity. In Christianity, when there was kind of spirit interest in a person, which would be seen as a negative thing, that there was the idea of obsession. And equally within Islam, there's the idea of was, the whispering, specifically the phrase means the whispering of devils, now, I know that's a very negative kind of dualistic way to look at it, but at least there was a framework to interpret, to in some way try and understand what was happening. Now, I don't think it was a sufficient one. I'm not having a pop at anybody who follows those faiths. I just don't think it was a sufficient one. It doesn't take up the breadth of the experience. It's like a one size fits all. However, the point of exploring these areas, developing a body of knowledge, your work and others who've been on the show is of immense value to people. I get emails all the time. People are talking about like, I literally don't understand what was happening to me, or I don't understand what's happening, or this is happening. And I listened to X show and, I could relate to it, and it's just, I think it's genuinely important, that you're able to offer that kind of perspective to people, so awesome. Thank you.
Well, the real difference between spiritual emergence and spiritual emergency, right, is access to resources in community. And a lot of other cultures, a lot of other countries do a much better job supporting spiritual emergence. And I think in particular in Western Europe and in America, we really have issues with spiritual emergency because there isn't that. And I'm someone who is very lucky that, especially for the past 10 years, I've had incredible mentors and teachers and traditions, and that I've been able to be held by people that I consider family, right? And have that sounding board for experience and have it validated and shared. And I think that's the only reason why I am in a position of, like relative, like comfort, like success, happiness, whatever, was because I had that. It wasn't anything that was special or endemic or of my own volition, right? It was literally because I've had, since I first started having really intense phenomena in my early 20s, and I had it all through my childhood years and part of my adolescence. But then it was all a wash for me in this lens of this must be, mental illness, right? And then in my early 20s was when I first had a teacher who was a Siberian shaman, and he recognized what was going on, and he spent about a year specifically focusing on trying to get me to do grounding techniques, right? Because he was like, you don't get to do any of the other stuff. And he was the first one who pointed out to me interesting things about my lineage that have been subsequently confirmed over and over again. But if I hadn't had that moment, I can't imagine where I would have been. I'd have shut down completely and compartmentalized everything, or I probably would be in really bad shape. So I think that I have been beyond fortunate to have had and have met the teachers, the peers, the community, the elders that I've needed. And that is, I think, what is missing from so much of what people communicate to me is a sense of loneliness, this loss, not knowing what to believe. And quite frankly, these experiences are scary, and there's very real dangers. There's very real dangers to having intranquil ancestors, right? And there's really bad possibilities. Like, I don't want to sugarcoat it, to having a history where certain pacts have been violated with spirits that pacts were once made with, right? Like, these things do exist, and they can cause tangible harm, and not everything is nice and friendly, and it's not as unnice or unfriendly as part of a culture will make you think, right? Not everyone's cursing you all the time. But there are, in particular with people that are drawn to working the others, there is very real consequence and harm. And I think that having had the tutelage and being held the way I've been held in my experience, I wish that genuinely for everyone.
Yeah. That makes an awful lot of sense. You raise a huge amount of interesting points there, and when I say look at some of the work that I've done exploring the jinn, and I've spoken to a number of kind of energy healers based in the States who have worked with people of kind of broad Islamic, or more specifically kind of Arabic origin, and the amount of multi-general stuff that comes up again and again is remarkable.
Yes,
like that, and it's exactly
hereditary.
It's exactly what you described. It generally is a broken pact, or indeed a promise of an ancestor or of one of their descendants. Yes, several
or
times.
A marriage that wasn't fulfilled. Like you are supposed to. And that the pact one is the biggest one that I have noticed, as well as particular hereditary familiars, right, or spirits that are bound to a line. And we forget whether it's the banshees that are connected to the different clans, or whether it's the ancestral family's jinn, or whether it is the Samaldivi, of a particular lineage of Paralitsas or whatever. Like there are spirits that their timeline are not the same as us. Just because we forgot, just because we didn't know, doesn't mean they're like over there like, excuse me. And again, we're going to see problems arise from those unacknowledged relationships or pacts. Again, it's not incredibly common. It's way more common than people think, right? Like it does, in my experience, it is an issue. Perhaps 1 out of every 15 clients I see has a very prominent, like for me to be able to notice and see it and then be validated by other experts and practitioners. This is the same sort of issue with that. And I mean, even when we're looking at issues with disavowing or rejecting the fetch or the Kareem, there's like we all have these also personal iterations of ourselves that are being rejected in part, and can cause poltergeist problems as well, right? Like sometimes the issue is actually someone splitting off from themselves, or the spirit that is ensouling their body in a way where that needs to be retrieved in part, in addition.
The same phenomena exists in or has it has a name in Irish Gaelic as well. It's it translates as the dual walker, the one that kind of walks with the individual. It's almost identical to the Kareen in terms of understanding. Same thing, like if you activate and start working with the Kareen, all chaos can break loose. It's not necessarily a good thing at all. Well, it isn't. Anyway, Sasha, it's been wonderful talking to you. For anybody who wants to find out more about you, your work, to have a consultancy with you, where's the best place for them to do so?
The best place would be my website, which is sasharavitch.com. And you can book through there. I am booked out by the way, but if you email me, it's very likely that I can try and fit you in earlier. So don't get discouraged by my calendar.
Well,
you can also find me Sasha Ravitch on Instagram. One needs to find me on Twitter because it's a little Luddite like. Just doing my best to understand how gifts work. And my Patreon, which is patreon.com/Sasha Ravitch, where I am often writing and creating theoretical and witchcraft rites through stellar and astrological lenses, whether through the lunar mansions or through the constellations and the stars, for elections that you can use your own magic through.
Awesome. Fantastic. Well, I will make sure to collate all the relevant links and have them in the show notes. Sasha, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you for coming to the Spirit Box.
Thank you so much. You have a wonderful evening.
There you have it. I hope you all enjoyed that and got something from that. I have to say I got a huge amount from that chat, and I'm really grateful to Sasha for coming on the show, and I hope we can do it again. Now, the links to Sasha's Patreon and to her reading booking website are in the show notes. I strongly recommend you reach out and make a booking if you're interested, because she's booked out for like 6 months, which speaks volumes in itself. And we will wrap up there. I'm Dara Mason, and you've been listening to The Spirit Box. Take care and talk soon. Bye.